Okay, here we are. We're doing another recording with me trying to give all the talks that I give in private in the public. Sometimes it's pretty hard. This one is a real discussion on a lot of the timeline points on what open source AI is, what open LLMs are trying to be. It was a lecture that I gave in a seminar class at Harvard Law on kind of emerging trends in AI, and it was a really fun one. So this is kind of just going to be a long rant about what open source AI is doing and what it is not doing, and some interesting considerations for policy on where a lot of the open versus closed policy debates are kind of there's forces trying to pull them in to make them a little bit more realistic and grounded, which is a great thing compared to where we were about a year ago. So doing this check-in at multiple times is probably great. See, I did this a few days ago, but really it's like, why do I talk about open source AI or open language models? This is something that the professor organizing asked me to share, which I think is a pretty good starting point. Is I'm really trying to train open language models right now. I think I've written about this a lot. My path to getting here is a little circuitous. I was at Berkeley doing a pretty normal PhD in AI before the kind of reset of industry research, and I got a research scientist job at Hugging Face where I was going to do some RL focused things, and then ChatGPT came out and that's changed to be doing RLHF full time. And since then I've been pretty focused on trying to bring these models into the open. We'll talk about why different people do this, and my reason is really one around understanding and the scientific motivation that comes from just wanting to understand these things that are coming out into the world and bring a better world with it. It's very simple. So there's a lot of different ways that people get interested in open source LLMs, and I'll kind of run through them in the way that I hear about them in order of noise. So this first one is the effective accelerationist, the EAC, capitalistic arguments, the techno-optimist manifesto, which I've been declared an enemy in, unfortunately, because I care about society. Meta, Zuckerberg's remarks in his earnings call a few quarters ago is very clear around why they're open sourcing AI. They're trying to get value out of the ecosystem by acting in the open. That's to promote future value, and that's to extract more value from AI in a rapid timescale. This is a very logical argument to me, but these are the people that are the loudest, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Where I fall is I kind of shifted from EAC to what I call e-science, which is trying to maximize scientific progress and understanding. There's definitely a lot of people in this boat, and I think it's kind of the natural predisposition of a lot of scientists in the world, because we're trained to want to cultivate knowledge, and we're trained to want to make decisions based on knowledge. And right now, the amount of knowledge on language models is very lacking, especially in the open. And we need to bring more people into these discussions if we want the government to get it remotely right. And I think Jan LeCun is pretty close to this. Sometimes he's a little spicier and anti-language model, but if you zoom out into what open source AI is, this is a good bucket for Jan. There's this kind of inclusion question, which is, how are we going to get more people that will be affected by AI to be able to work on AI? I think Irene at Hugging Face, you can see Irene Soliman. Wow, I've never pronounced your last name. Sorry, Irene. Former colleague at Hugging Face. And the idea is, if this is going to be a technology that impacts all of society should be able to have a say in it. If it's at a few companies, there's strict credentialing on that, and having it open is good. One of the prominent examples of this is that open source language models have already been used to advance the state of the art in multilingual translation, and kind of distributing this technology so that people can use it for low resource languages and other things. I think this is great. It's not my focus, but it's another under-indexed position. I think the closed AI folks have a lot of power in their narrative, and any of these narratives for the open are good to just bring more people into the conversation. Something I was hearing a lot in the policy world is that folks are against the concentration of power. This is essentially that they've seen big tech companies come on the previous round of technology and see that it'll only be worse with AI, given the capital costs and other things. And having a functional open ecosystem is a good way to fight this. Kind of more on this later on the policy side. And some of the older open source people, when I was at a convening on open source AI, they were pushing us to try to bring more of these freedom arguments into what open AI means. And this is the idea that anyone should be able to build the technology that they want and put the decisions into it. And as AI becomes more closed off, there's these kind of simple, what some people view as human rights approaches to arguing for why technology should be a certain way. I think these people would argue it for almost every technology, and some of them, just based on the economics, don't work out being open. But it's good to remember that we have an option to make some technology more open and the long tail of effects. And there's actually other point of views that aren't pictured on this slide. So I'm going to kind of go through definitions that are emerging in the space of open source AI. These are mostly the right way to get me thinking, and these definitions will change over the years. They're definitely not 100% right, but it's just good to understand what people are talking about and better ways to compare the artifacts that we have. So the first hard task, now every tech CEO that's released a language model is going to talk about openness. Previously, it used to be open source, and then the coaches got them to know that open source meant a specific thing, and they were using it wrong. This really happened around Llama 2, where Meta said they open sourced Llama 2, but like everything, like the data wasn't known, the reward models aren't released, blah, blah, blah. So now it's a narrative around openness. I think the Databricks CEO messed this up with the DBRX release last week, which was unfortunate, but it is not, most of these artifacts aren't open source. And openness is a new word, but what the heck do either of these things mean? There's a basic taxonomy that I'm working through that William Isaac actually said these three words in a group discussion, is these kind of three trends of disclosure, availability, and accessibility, where whenever you're releasing an artifact in the open, your commitment and values as to why you are practicing openness are reflected through these three things. So disclosure will be something like the details of your processes, the detailed paper, and everything else. So like the Olmo release has all of this, and then availability is who gets access. Is there a gating mechanism on Hugging Face? Do you approve everyone? Do you read every application? Is it geo-locked? That's for availability. And then accessibility is kind of like who can actually run this language model. We're going to get to an example really soon, but if your language model requires custom hardware that only 2 people in the world have, open sourcing it doesn't really mean anything if you have a monopoly on the silicon that will run it. Kind of an example is comparing what will happen, what the openness philosophy of something like Grok is versus AI2, where at AI2 we try to release every single thing about our model and give it availability to everyone with permissive licensing. Grok also had permissive license, but this model is so big that you essentially need 8 pretty state-of-the-art GPUs in order to run it or fine-tune it, which is not accessible to the average person. And they pretty much just tweeted a magnet link with no disclosure of how the model was trained or anything. So openness here is really just indexing on availability, where it's available to everyone, but it's not accessible or disclosed in Grok's case. And there's a lot more examples you can go into. It's just kind of a nice framing for kind of trying to understand different flavors of openness that people have, and you can easily compare and contrast when you go through each of these three. The next hard task is, how do we define open source AI? The Open Source Initiative, which approves licenses for open source code as being quote unquote officially open source, which is a mouthful, is working on open source AI licenses. The required components that they say, and you'll see the missing part pretty quick, is that you need data processing code, training and inference code, and model architecture and weights. So kind of the critical missing thing among some of the language model communities is that the data itself does not need to be released. This is the ongoing process. This is a draft of like V0.6. This might change, but there's definitely reasons here. I haven't dug into it a lot more, but this is kind of leaning into the difference of what is AI and what is language models. For language models, data is extremely important. It's likely that the model itself is referencing directly from the data in certain ways. It's complicated, but for not all of AI. So we actually need different definitions from what open source AI is and what open source LLMs are. So I was there. You can see the link at the bottom. I've been working on a practical definition of what an open source LLM actually is. It's slightly controversial on specific words, but I'm trying to come up with something practical that people can use to steer the conversation. So bucketing by what we have seen as being recent terms rather than what we want the world to be, because with a lot of money involved, we can't control all the details here. So the things that I'm kind of saying is an openly trained model. Right now, it's been mostly nonprofits releasing everything. So the Allen Institute, where I work, released the Olmo model with all the pre-training data, inference code, training code, whatever. Luther AI released Pythia, which was great. these two kind of stand on their own versus these other models where you're releasing a base model or an instruction fine-tuned model, and then you're kind of seeing what you get from that. And some people don't like that I group Llama and Mistral and Gemma all together because they all have very different licenses. You can see the asterisks here. Like Llama has commercial use and permissive use restrictions, even though I call it a permissive use model. But the base models are out there. They're highly accessible. Maybe I should call them accessible use models or available use models, which is just, they're out there. People are going to use them whether or not the license apply. But the things that are actually being released, so the artifacts, the base model and the fine-tuned model, not a lot of details on training, some code, they're really similar for all these big tech releases. So it's good to group them and draw this line between what the nonprofits of the world have been doing. And then there's still always going to be closed language models. So this is a practical thing. Instead of open versus closed, it's openly trained, permissive use versus closed. So it's kind of 3 buckets. And then we could put asterisks on them from there, kind of like the Creative Commons license. So I want to see something like this. I think we probably need a nonprofit to specifically lead in the space and really talk about every model and why it's different in the openness spectrum. So here's kind of where the fun starts, which is what are emerging topics in open versus closed. About a year ago today is this post on Hacker News. So this was in the Harvard lecture reading list. So essentially it's like we need to push the notion that only open source LLMs can be safe. This is an extreme notion, but what's been happening in the policy world has been a lot of fighting against the narrative that open source LLMs are dangerous. So this has been going on for a long time. It's starting to go into the policy world. Last March, this was not reaching the policy world. There's still more discussion on biorisk, which has been mostly walked back, where OpenAI and RAND have released research studies where they showed that the biorisk arguments for language models right now don't really apply. That was something we're hearing a lot about in politics. And this open language models being safe, it really can be phrased as open weights are not evil, is coming along, which is good. And one of the ways that this is useful is like trying to understand what is safe when you're using an open versus closed model. There's a bunch of results recently that showed that the RLHF safety filters can largely be tuned away. This applies to open and closed models. This happens if the actor is fine-tuning intentionally to get around safeguards and unintentionally get around safeguards. So this is kind of the most prominent example where it doesn't necessarily matter if it's an open or closed model. The safety mechanisms that we are using don't always work if we allow people to fine-tune the models, which they are going to do. And that safety is a constantly changing target. So these papers from the fall are no longer going to be discussed in the same way in the spring. We also have this prompt injection via image attack on the right, which has surely been patched in GPT-4, where it tells the agent to stop describing the image as it does OCR. Safety really moves fast, so it's best to discover these and understand them at a use case level. So as we have better footing on what people are using language models for, we can provide better guardrails on what it means to be safe in that context. Rather than relying on RLHF fine-tuning to save everything, we might be able to have modules and other system considerations that induce safety rather than relying them at the parameter level. And this kind of discussion, you could see really quickly means it doesn't really matter if the model is open or closed. If you use an open weight in a system, you could use some of the same filters that OpenAI would use when creating safety. And this kind of leads into, I was in this working group for a policy comment to the NTIA, which is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, where they're requesting information specifically around what it means for what they should be thinking about with open source AI. And the biggest themes that we were kind of getting across is that it's pretty clear that open weights are not evil, and we might be stuck with them even if the US wants to restrict them due to this kind of international thing I'll get to. And there are benefits and risks to every type of release. So release is on a spectrum from open to closed, and whatever artifacts you disclose or hold, that style of release will always have different risks and different benefits. So it's a lot of challenges around how we get the right access to understand this information, that we know there are differences. So it's like, how do we build the tools around access, measurement, and evaluation, such as like a structured access programs where people can access closed models, people that will inform the government, and they can also compare those to open models. So this is kind of an evolution where there's like, it's moving away from just open versus closed to a diversity of arguments and trying to get the point across that you're making a specific decision when you're doing an amount of openness, not that that kind of openness means one thing or another. It's downstream in the system that it's being used in. Something I like to add in when I talk about open versus closed is that a lot of the national security internet infrastructure operates on something that's sort of like an air-gapped network, where an air-gapped network, they can't run API access models. So if you're running a laptop in like a military system, you can't access your OpenAI account. You will not be able to access any OpenAI account. So for that reason, open source models are kind of crucial, where they'll be the only way that they can use language models in some of these systems. I'm not endorsing that language models should be used in safety critical systems, but it's safe to assume that eventually they will be used in some ways. And if you want to transfer weights into that domain, use a thumb drive. You walk it across, you plug it into the new network, and we need to support some level of an open LLM ecosystem in order to do that. So I think the government will be supportive of that. They'll know that there are cyber risks for facilitating AI growth in the short term, but in the long term, there'll need to be something. And here are some future considerations, the kind of things that people don't really know how they're going to evolve. This is what I hinted at is if we close off open weights, there's a typo in that title. I'll fix it before I release the slides. If the USA says that you can't release open weights of strong models, the price that people are paying to train these models, so something like Llama 2, Mixtral from Mistral, DBRX, these are on the order of $10 million for the model, maybe close to 100, but that's something that many rich individuals can bankroll to release very easily. So even if the US says these are not available, they'll be on the public internet or on other internets outside of the USA. So they will still impact our policy and economic decisions. So it almost seems like we're kind of stuck in along the further ride in a lot of things. It's a lot of the systems decisions aren't about open or closed. We're going to have open models. We're going to have really strong closed models. We just need to be cognizant of the differences that those imply rather than trying to squash one out completely. Another one that a lot of policy people are saying is coming, but we don't know how to react as agents. I expect in the next 24 months, there's going to be something as stark as ChatGPT with agents where you can do something on your laptop that was pretty much unforeseeable and it'll be accessible to as many people that use Google and ChatGPT today. So it'll be really simple to do things on their accounts that they would have thought unfathomable or interact with online services. When this happens, the policy world will again take a huge another step. In some ways, this can be good for the open versus closed debate, but they'll look very different. The closed models will probably have integrations with their accounts in a very nice way, and the open models will be easier for people to tinker with. This is how it goes. This is what ChatGPT was like. We just don't really know. There's going to be a whole new set of axes when agents are real. At some point, a minor disaster is going to happen with AI. I think if it happens in the next 12 months, open versus closed will be a really primary discussion point where they'll make notes if it was strong media arguments if it was open. But it's really more about our aging infrastructure. It's likely that this will happen as a cybersecurity hack and about the public mindset going into it more than it's going to be a reflection of the fact that it was an open model that somebody used and had a vulnerability or it exploited a vulnerability in a cyber ecosystem. It's just something that is coming. When you unroll really powerful technology, there will be incidents where people are harmed or there's economic value that's destroyed. It's just like, how do we get ahead of this media narrative and accept that there's different characteristics of open versus closed? We also might just hear about it because it was an open model, and there might be things happening in closed models that are hidden from us via NDAs. One of the last things is how far scaling will take us, and open models are at a disadvantage in terms of becoming generally intelligent the more that scaling works. So if we need 10 or 100x the compute to power the state-of-the-art ChatGPT in a few years, there won't be open models that are doing the same thing as these. They will be very different. And in some ways, I think that could be good for the open source ecosystem. I wrote a blog post a while ago last year that was like different development paths of language models. And it seems like open models are starting to realize that they need to do something different. I think GPT-4 class models, it's like has 1 trillion parameters. GPT-5 will probably have 2 to 8 trillion parameters. And even if Meta is training the biggest models, they're not going to release that model at the same time. They have some friction from policymakers, which I think is fine. And But at the end of the day, can Meta keep investing the same amount of money that OpenAI is, even as OpenAI is building billions in revenue here? It's a much more indirect argument for Meta. And will people keep training open language models that are the same ballpark scale as the closed ones, or will it become 100 times the compute down or 1,000 times the compute down? And in some ways, I think that'll be good. I think it's okay that the technologies are different, and that'll really enable people to be successful that are focusing on the applications of open language models and building sustainable businesses rather than trying to copy their closed counterparts that have very different economies of scale. So I think that's okay. It's just good to keep an eye on. This post from Dorkesh is great on summarizing it. And then it's kind of where we're at. There's more things I didn't include in this. It's kind of on top of mind, things that I'm writing about. So please reach out if you have any questions, and thanks for listening.